On the night of May 26, 1940, Private Albert Mitchell of the Royal Fusiliers stood on a beach in northern France and listened. The sound he was waiting for was engines. Specifically, the sound of small boat engines crossing the English Channel in the dark. Around him, 338,000 men waited on the same beach. They had been waiting for 3 days. The German army was 9 miles away. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In our world, the boats came. They came because 4 days earlier, on the afternoon of May 24th, Adolf Hitler had issued an order that military historians still argue about. He ordered his panzer divisions to halt. General Heinz Guderian, whose tanks were close enough to the beaches to see the channel glittering in the afternoon light, received the order and could not believe it. His armor was 2 days from annihilating the entire British expeditionary force. He had never been told to stop when he was winning. He stopped anyway. That halt order bought 338,000 men the time they needed to reach the water. Nobody knows with certainty why Hitler issued it. Some historians argue he wanted to preserve his armor for the drive south into France. Others believe he genuinely thought Britain would negotiate once France fell, and destroying her army on a beach would make negotiation impossible. Guderian himself wrote in his memoirs that the order was incomprehensible to him then, and remained incomprehensible to him for the rest of his life. What is not incomprehensible is the arithmetic. Churchill had been Prime Minister for exactly 16 days when Dunkirk began. Britain had fewer than 500,000 trained soldiers on home soil. The men on that beach represented almost everything the British Army had. Their weapons, their vehicles, their artillery, virtually all of it was already abandoned in the fields behind them. They had nothing left to fight with except themselves. Remove the halt order. Let Guderian's tanks roll on the morning of May 24th. The beaches are encircled in 48 hours. The evacuation never begins. Private Mitchell never makes it home. 338,000 men are killed or captured in 72 hours. Churchill is still alive. He is still fighting. He is standing in the cabinet war rooms beneath Westminster with no army, no allies, and a decision in front of him that will determine the shape of the century. What he does next is the question. The cabinet war rooms beneath Westminster smelled of cigarette smoke and damp concrete. Churchill sat at the head of a table on May 28, 1940, and listened to a man make the most rational argument he had ever heard for surrendering. Lord Edward Halifax was not a coward. He was the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, a former Viceroy of India, a man who had governed hundreds of millions of people with quiet competence. He believed in facts. The facts, as he laid them out that morning, were these: Britain had no army. France was collapsing. The United States had made clear it would not intervene. Italy's Mussolini was offering to broker negotiations with Germany. The terms being discussed through backchannels would leave the British Empire intact. Britain would lose Europe but keep everything else. Halifax looked at Churchill and asked, in his measured way, what exactly they were fighting for at this point. In our world, Churchill refused. The BEF came home from Dunkirk 4 days later, exhausted and weaponless but alive, and their survival gave Churchill the political ground to stand on. He could point to 338,000 reasons why Britain could still fight. In this world, those men are gone. And Halifax wins the argument. The armistice is signed in the same railway car at Compiègne where Germany surrendered in 1918. Hitler insists on it. The symbolism matters to him enormously. Britain retains its empire nominally. The Royal Navy remains intact. In exchange, Britain recognizes German dominion over continental Europe and agrees to cease all hostilities. Churchill resigns. He retires to Chartwell and begins drinking more heavily than usual. Halifax becomes Prime Minister of a nation that has, for the first time in its modern history, chosen survival over principle. What makes this moment almost unbearable is how reasonable it was. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had written in an internal RAF memo in August 1940 that Fighter Command had, at its current rate of attrition, perhaps 2 to 3 weeks of effective resistance remaining. That was in our timeline with the BEF's morale behind them. Without Dunkirk, without the army, that number shrinks to days. Halifax saved lives. Hundreds of thousands of them. History would spend the next century deciding whether that made him a villain or simply a man who understood arithmetic. America was watching from across the Atlantic. Roosevelt had no democratic Britain left to justify intervention. He had no argument to make to Congress, no burning London to show on newsreels. He had only the Pacific, and the Pacific was about to explode. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In the spring of 1942, Albert Speer stood in a large room in Berlin and looked at a model of a city that did not exist yet. The model covered the entire floor. It showed wide roads, huge stone buildings, and a dome so large that clouds would form inside it from the body heat of the crowds below. Hitler had designed much of it himself. He called it Germania. It would replace Berlin as the capital of a new empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Ural Mountains. Speer was 36 years old. He was Hitler's favorite architect. He believed, or told himself he believed, that his job was simply to build beautiful things. The plans for what would fill the land between Berlin and those Ural Mountains were written in a different kind of document. It was called General Plan Ost. The German words mean Master Plan East. It was real. It was drafted in 1941 and 1942 by planners in Berlin. It called for the removal or death of 45 million people across Eastern Europe over 20 years. Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, and others would be pushed east, worked to death in labor camps, or simply starved. Germans would take their farms and their houses and their villages. In a small village in Ukraine in 1942, a farmer named in the occupation records only by his family name, Kovalenko, watched German administrators arrive with clipboards. They counted his grain. They counted his livestock. They wrote numbers in columns. They did not speak to him. Within a year, his village's food was being shipped west to feed German factory workers building tanks. Kovalenko and his neighbors were left with what remained. What remained was not enough. This was not chaos. It was policy. It was organized with the same technical precision that Speer was using to design the dome in Berlin. The same civilization that produced Beethoven and Goethe was running the starvation of 45 million people on a spreadsheet. Speer knew some of this. His own post-war testimony, given at Nuremberg and later in his written memoirs, confirmed that he knew more than he admitted. He kept designing. The dome grew taller in the drawings. The roads grew wider. The model on the floor gleamed under the drafting room lights. Outside the window to the east, the dark was very deep. Japan had just bombed Pearl Harbor. America had entered the war. But it had entered alone, with no Europe left to save, only an ocean and an enemy to its west. And in the desert of New Mexico, a physicist was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. Robert Oppenheimer arrived at Los Alamos, New Mexico in the spring of 1943. The altitude was 7,000 feet. The air was thin and cold and smelled of pine. The facility had no official name on any public document. Mail came addressed to a post office box number. The scientists who lived there could not tell their families where they were. In our timeline, the Manhattan Project was driven by a specific fear. Germany had a head start on nuclear research. Otto Hahn had split the atom in Berlin in 1938. Werner Heisenberg was running the German nuclear program. Roosevelt's advisors calculated that if Germany built a working bomb first, the war was over in the worst possible way. That fear focused American scientific effort with an urgency that money alone could not have manufactured. In this timeline, the fear is worse. Germany has not just a head start on a bomb. Germany has won. It controls the scientific institutions of France, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. It has access to the uranium mines of the Belgian Congo through its arrangement with occupied Belgium. It has Heisenberg and time and resources, and no Eastern Front consuming its industrial capacity. The phone call Oppenheimer received in the spring of 1943 did not ask him to build a weapon before Germany could. It told him Germany was already building one. The Manhattan Project received everything. There was no European theater competing for steel, for copper, for the electrical output of the Tennessee Valley Authority. The project that, in our timeline, consumed $2 billion and the energy of 130,000 people now consumed more. It moved faster. The Trinity test in the New Mexico desert happened in April 1945 instead of July. The device worked. The yield was 21 kilotons. The flash was visible for 200 miles. Oppenheimer watched it and said what he later recalled saying in our timeline. He quoted the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He said it quietly, to nobody in particular, standing in the pre-dawn dark of the desert. Then the argument began. Japan was the enemy America was fighting. Tokyo was the logical target. But Germany had murdered 12 million people in documented extermination camps already overrun by nobody, because there was no advancing Soviet army, no liberating American force. The camps were still running. Some men in Washington wanted to send the bomb east. Oppenheimer knew what both targets meant. He had helped build the weapon. He had not been asked where to aim it. That decision was being made in a room he was not invited into. In 1955, a boy named Pavel walked to school on a street that used to have a different name. The sign above the door of the school was written in German. The lessons inside were taught in German. Pavel spoke German without an accent because he had learned it before he learned to read. His grandfather, a farmer who had survived the early occupation years by hiding grain under the floorboards of his barn, remembered another language. He did not teach it to Pavel. It was the kind of thing that drew attention. The street had been called something else before 1942. Most of the people who remembered its old name were gone. This was not the chaos of wartime. By 1955, the German administration of Eastern Europe was 15 years old. It had its own bureaucracy, its own railway timetables, its own school inspectors who visited classrooms and checked that lessons were being taught correctly. The machine worked. That was the most frightening thing about it. It did not need jackboots in the street every morning to function. It needed forms filled out correctly and trains running on time and children who had never known anything else. 40 million people lived under this system. Most of them had stopped fighting it openly because the ones who fought openly had already been removed. What remained was quieter. A farmer who hid one sentence of his own language in the mind of a grandchild he trusted. A priest who kept a book under the stone floor of a church. A woman in what had been Krakow who memorized poems in Polish and recited them to herself at night in a voice too low for the walls to carry. Albert Speer was 50 years old in 1955. He was no longer building Germania. The dome had been scaled back twice for resource reasons. He had been moved sideways in the regime's hierarchy, the way men are moved when they are useful but no longer necessary. He had begun writing privately, in notebooks he kept locked in a drawer in his home office. The notebooks were not memoirs. They were questions. He wrote them in the careful handwriting of a man who had spent his career drawing precise lines on paper. The questions were about what he had known and when he had known it. He did not show them to anyone. The regime was stable. The resistance was real but small. And in New Mexico, the physicist who had watched the desert turn white in the pre-dawn dark was being asked, quietly, to come back to work. The second weapon would be larger than the first. In 1966, Albert Speer, the real one, sat in Spandau prison in West Berlin and wrote his memoirs. He had been there for 20 years. The Nuremberg Tribunal had sentenced him to 20 years for war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was the only senior Nazi official who claimed at trial that he had not known about the extermination camps. Historians have spent decades arguing about whether that was true. The evidence suggests it was not. His book, published in 1969, was called Inside the Third Reich. It documented, in the careful handwriting of a precise man, exactly how close the nightmare had come. He wrote about the halt order at Dunkirk. He wrote about the Halifax negotiations. He wrote about General Plan Ost as a functioning administrative reality, not a theoretical document. He had been inside the machine. He knew how well it ran. The world of the previous 5 chapters was not invented. Every element of it was drawn from documented plans, real orders, actual policies already in partial operation by 1942. The German administration of occupied Poland was already implementing the General Plan Ost. The The Germania models existed. The atomic research was real. The margin between that world and this one was not ideology or inevitability. It was a single order issued on the afternoon of May 24, 1940, by a man who stopped his tanks 9 miles from a beach. The boats came because of that order. 338,000 men reached England because of that order. Churchill kept his argument, his army, and his resolve because of that order. The margin was not courage or destiny. It was days. It was one decision, made for reasons historians still cannot fully explain, by the man who was trying to destroy everything the decision accidentally saved. The boats came. That time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.